Very exciting for us to see all of you here this evening. We're also very pleased to be hosting Shefali Luthra, who's here for us to talk about her very important new book, Undue Burden, Life and Death Decisions in Post-Roe America. It's been nearly 2 years since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. That decision, as Shefali notes in her book, led to the subsequent elimination or significant reduction of legalized abortion in more than 20 states. This, in turn, has dramatically reshaped the lives of Americans from all backgrounds and in many places around the country. Shefali's been traveling around the U.S. and speaking with many people about the ripple effects of the court's decision on abortion. The book focuses on several particular patients to highlight the devastating impact on individuals of the new limits. It also reflects the difficult experience of doctors and nurses who are trying to maintain the U.S. reproductive healthcare system now under terrible strain in this post-Roe world. Shefali's narrative is often quite vivid and written with a lot of passion. It definitely helps humanize what the change in the law has meant for many, many people. In reporting for the book, Shefali says she heard people express the same emotions over and over: fear, anger, and a sense of betrayal. The stories in the book, as Shefali says at the start, reinforce an obvious truth, namely that abortion access is a story of racial and economic inequality, a story of healthcare, and a story of human rights. Denying people abortion, Shefali writes, not only denies them control over their own bodies, it also can entrench them in poverty and make them feel like second-class citizens. Now, as someone who's been covering national health policy for about a decade, Shefali is quite well positioned to tell this story. She's currently the health reporter for the 19th, which is a nonprofit newsroom that focuses on gender, politics, and policy. And before that, she spent 6 years as correspondent at Kaiser Health News. She's joined in conversation here this evening by another journalist, Vitali, who's the Capitol Hill correspondent for ABC News. Her own book, Electable, about the 2020 presidential campaign, but particularly about the double standards placed on women presidential candidates, that came out about a couple of years ago. So please join me in welcoming Shefali and Vitali.
Hometown crowd, give it up for the hometown girl. I was so excited when Shefali and I were able to do this together, and then you asked me. It means the world. All of these people are here because they know how essential this work is. You guys can see I'm reading off of my manuscript floppy copy that I have not let go of since it was mailed to me, because this work is so essential. I'm sure that many of you have already dug into these chapters. It's raw, the emotion is fully palpable, and I hope that you're so proud of the work that you put out there at this really pivotal moment in policy and politics and the personal stories here. So we can dive in. And as we're talking, we'll do this for about 30 minutes, 35, and if you guys have questions, please, we will leave ample time for that. And we'll start just from the top, which is that, I think you and I have both been covering this for a long time, and I think the thing I always come back to is how much of where we are right now, post-Roe, is Trump, and how much of it is where Republicans were going no matter what, and he was just the carpenter from there.
I think that is such an important question, and first, thank you for that very generous introduction. I am very, very excited to be doing this with you. There's no one else I would rather have for this conversation. what I get in the book is something that I think is really important, is that Roe was under attack since it was decided. There was a slew of anti-abortion bills put into state houses the year after Roe. That never really stopped, and especially in 2013, it became this pet project for the Tea Party in particular. They swarmed state houses out of the backs of an unpopular President Obama, and they passed bill after bill that clearly violated the Roe standard. And all of these were meant as tests to try and weaken Roe, to weaken abortion rights. By the time we got to where the book really begins, which is several months before the Dobbs decision, when Texas passed its 6-week abortion ban and that took effect and cut off access for so many people, abortion was for a lot of people a right in name only. If you looked at Missouri, there was only one clinic left standing. If you looked at the Rio Grande Valley, where the book ends, there was also only one clinic standing for a massive part of the second biggest state in the country. And what this really underscores is that the loss of Roe had seismic implications for people who could no longer legally get abortions. But even before that, the limits that had been put upon abortion, the medically unnecessary, scientifically unproven restriction placed upon clinics, had really, really chipped away at this right. And a lot of people, especially people in power in Washington, did not care or did not notice.
Or maybe weren't prepared, right?
I think that is a huge part of it. And that is another theme that we come back to over and over again is when the 6-week ban took effect in Texas, when oral arguments took effect for the Dobbs case that following December, people who were watching, who had been studying, looking at providing abortions for a very long time, could tell that this was about to be the end, that in Texas, Roe had functionally fallen, that in all likelihood the votes were there to overturn Roe nationally, and that even if there weren't, a playbook had been given for states to ban abortion if they so chose. And yet, we got the Dobbs leak in May of 2022.
Yeah, there was a preview. Hey guys,
yes,
you've got 2 months of a heads up. If you want to stop it, please feel free to plan.
And it's so striking. You look at the text that was leaked, you look at the decision, they are almost word for word the same. And still, we came to June 24th, 2022, almost 2 years ago today, and we got that decision. And there was shock, there was a lot of confusion, and then there was really nothing but questions from all levels of power in Washington, people trying to figure out, how can we respond, what can we do, and very often saying, well, we need more time, we didn't know this was going to happen. When, if you had been listening to the people working in this field, providing care, seeking care, it should have and could have been very clear that this is where we were headed.
I think we often talk about this through a politics and policy lens. Obviously, we are several blocks from the Capitol. That's basically where I pay rent these days. You spend so much time there digging into the policy weeds, not just in D.C., but in other capitals that are passing this kind of legislation. I wonder, as you got more into the personal stories, talking to actual people who in many cases, you talk to Kate Cox and other women who have sort of been drafted into this movement unwillingly. Do you find that people are attaching the blatant R versus D politics to this? Like, okay, Republicans are the ones that are taking this from me, Democrats are the ones that want to protect it but may not have a plan to do so. Do they connect them?
I think that is just not the way people think about this when they think about getting an abortion. And I think about the people I spoke to whose stories are in this book. They didn't think that much for the most part about abortion until they had to, because, we all are people who use healthcare, we all get medical care. And I don't wake up thinking, ooh, someday I might need physical therapy. Let me think about all the rules and regulations around how PT is provided, because that is just not how we live. And so for these people, they didn't think about the laws and policies and who provided and who supported, who opposed abortion. And then they were pregnant, and they could not be for whatever reason. And all they could see was that this was something so difficult, in some cases impossible to get, and they didn't understand why. And it made them feel like less of a person. It made them feel, as I write in the book, deeply betrayed by the country they live in. And more importantly, this wasn't political for them. And they couldn't understand why it was, because for them it was fundamentally personal, it was fundamentally healthcare.
There's one potential explanation for that, right? And I was so struck, and for those of you who are not up and watching cable news at 5 o'clock in the morning, we did this conversation in part on MSNBC earlier this week, and one of the things we brought up was the fact that you write that in the 17 and 1800s, abortion was pretty much standard fare. There were really no religious objections to it, and then you get to the 1880s, and it becomes a moment where a largely male-dominated medical sphere can find ways to restrict the work of largely female doulas. And it's hard for me not to draw a thread between the ways that I have heard women say, oh, abortion is just about restricting the choices that we can make about our bodies. Draw that thread there.
I really love that this is something that we get to talk about in the book. I do want to shout out my brilliant editor at Doubleday, Kara Riley, who was in this audience, who really, really pushed me to make sure that we did include the history. And we did think about the level to which misogyny has played a role in limiting access to abortion. And I think what you pick up on is something that is really important, is that abortion became a contested, controversial, and political issue because of efforts to cut women out of providing health care. It became a political issue, again, in the later half of the 20th century as a form of politics, as a form of policing how we think about gender and how we express gender. And I think that is just something that is very, very hard to miss when you look at the arguments people are making around people who seek abortions, and when you think about the narratives that we do and don't emphasize in terms of who actually gets this. It's something that I thought about a lot in framing this book is there are people in this book who get abortions because they want to be pregnant and will die or will have a terrible loss if they don't get an abortion. And those stories are critical. But there are also stories that are the more common form of abortion, which is someone gets pregnant and for whatever reason says, I can't do this right now. I cannot be a parent to another child. Maybe I already have one. Maybe I can't afford another one. And those stories are very important. They are not heard as often because they don't fit into this ideal that we have of what it means to be, a woman who wants to pursue motherhood above all else. And I really, really try to correct that narrative because I think it's foundational for us to think about how we understand what abortion means and who it affects, and ultimately why it matters so much from a health and equality perspective.
Do you see pop culture in helping that? I mean, I remember probably 10, 12 years ago, back at the height of Girls, and one of the characters in this show, however problematic it is as we look back on it, one of the characters in this show decided to have an abortion simply because she wanted one. And I remember at the time the number of think pieces I was reading that were like, oh my God, the casualizing of abortion. I don't feel like that's the case anymore.
I think you're right, and God, I could talk truly for hours about the way that Girls doing this. Because, right, we do have the Gillian Jacobs character who gets her abortion very, cavalier. Right? Well, I think about the final season a lot and how they're just not doing abortions.
My Roman Empire.
Truly. But I think to what you're talking about, we have seen a really significant shift in how abortion appears in the public discourse in just the past 2 years. And that's happened in large part because so many more people have been willing to come forward and say, I got an abortion, or I needed an abortion, and I could not get one, and this is why. And every person I spoke to in this book, I think, is incredibly brave for sharing their story. They knew that they had to do this for two reasons. One, so that others who got abortions would feel less alone. And the other was because they felt that it was important to add a human face to this to try and change things. But I do think, I don't want to be naive or Pollyanna-ish, a lot of people who shared their stories did not want their full names published in this book. And that's also for a reason, which is for all the progress we have made in talking about and thinking about and centering what it means to get an abortion and to choose when and how to become pregnant, there is an incredible amount of stigma that is attached to this. And a distinction that I think about often is there are people who say they support abortion rights in theory, and they say, great, people should get abortions, but not someone I know. And if the person I know gets an abortion, then I will think less of them. And people are not blind to this. There are people in this book who told me about their abortions who have never told anyone else about them and probably never will because they know that doing so would break family bonds irreparably. And that's a terrible thing to have to risk.
Do you find that just in the typically red states or rural areas or places that you would assume? Probably not, right?
Absolutely not. Abortion stigma is really widespread. There are physicians I spoke to in this book who could not rent medical office space in Colorado. We have seen this happen in California where people do not want abortion provided, practiced, talked about near where they are because they like the idea of supporting it in theory, but heaven forbid they have to deal with the practice of it in their presence. Heaven forbid they have to see the protesters, and certainly they do not want, in many cases, their tax dollars to support people getting it, even though our tax dollars often do support the provision of healthcare. That is what Medicare is. That is what Medicaid is.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm glad you bring up the doctors to this point, because the one that sticks in my mind as I was reading, and I'm going to admit to you, I thought this was beautifully written and beautifully reported, but there were moments I had to put it down. It's really taxing to hear the trauma that's inflicted on these people who are trying to just make their choices, and the title fits it perfectly for that reason. But the person who sticks out in my mind is the doctor in Texas who was petrified by what he was seeing on an ultrasound for a woman who was pregnant in a pretty shocking fashion. And he's saying, I can't intervene, almost mumbling it. She remembers. I mean, when you talk to providers for this reporting, are they just out of their minds? I mean, I've met people who are just aghast that this is what it's come to.
They are so scared, and they are very confused. And it is, again, hard to blame them because the laws keep changing day in, day out. And I spoke to providers who, they were giving medication abortions in Illinois, the state where abortion is protected. And they said, well, I know that if I give medication, the first medication here, the mifepristone, that's protected because they're in Illinois. But what if they go home and take the second pill tomorrow or in 2 days because there's that 24 to 48-hour waiting period? Is that an abortion in a state with a ban? Will I have broken the law? Will I be in trouble? And there are physicians out there who, as a result, changed their prescribing practices. They said, take these medications at once, which is effective, but less so. Risk this potential combination of failing and having to come back, because the concern for us, the legal concern of having our doctors get sued via medical practices that operate on shoestring budgets was just too much for them to bear. And I think what that has really underscored and exemplified for me is that no one knows what is going on here, and we will have legal questions about this for a very long time to come. And people's rights, their abilities to provide or receive care, will change day to day, and it is impossible to keep track, even if you do this for a living.
But that's the point, right?
I think about this polling from the Kaiser Family Foundation that I think I cited in the book, but if not, I've cited it many times in casual conversation, which is that people do not know if abortion is legal in their state. People often have inaccurate understandings of what is allowed, and you can be quibble about whether the confusion is or is not deliberate. I'm not really interested in litigating how people intend things to happen, but I am interested in the impact, which is it is obvious what has happened. There are people afraid to travel. There are people afraid to order medications home to their states that, are being prescribed by physicians protected by shield laws, and they still fear that, what if I am found breaking the law because I'm getting these pills, even though no abortion ban specifically criminalizes patients? And fear is a very powerful deterrent. Fear is something that can keep people from accessing healthcare that they need or are entitled to. It can also force them to go to unsurmountable or really difficult to surmount lengths to attain that healthcare.
One of the things that I think people don't realize is we spend a lot of time talking about Planned Parenthood. I think for the casual observer, they think, okay, like Planned Parenthood equals abortion, which it doesn't. I mean, there's so many other things that Planned Parenthood provides, but there's also, you touch on this in the book, one of them that I'm in touch with often in Colorado, but abortion funds. First, just in case anyone else is not, sort of steeped in this on the regular, talk about what abortion funds do and why they're different and how they're so helpful in the cases that you talk about where someone has to travel and has to have multiple barriers that they're trying to clear.
Abortion funds are very important, and they existed before the Dobbs decision because abortion has always been very expensive to get in this country. It has required people to spend a lot of money that they do not necessarily have for an inherently unplanned expense because, no one plans to get an abortion. They don't plan to get unintentionally pregnant. And at the same time, this is something largely not covered by insurance, especially if you are on Medicaid, because of the Hyde Amendment, which is a federal policy that prohibits federal dollars from supporting abortion. If Medicaid, which insures low-income people, covers abortion, it is because the state has deliberately made it a point to do so using state money. That's not true in a lot of places. It's not true in most states in this country. And so abortion funds help fill that gap to the best of their ability. They are these very small, a few full-time employees at most, a lot of volunteers, nonprofit organizations. Money comes in, money goes out. They help pay for people's travel costs. They help pay for people's abortions. They might help you cover the cost of childcare. the pressures put upon abortion funds, including the one in Colorado, one of the critical destination states for abortion now, are extraordinary. We now have funds that have become travel agencies. They also coordinate childcare. They help people find hotels. They help you figure out where is the closest appointment as soon as I can get. Should I go to North Carolina where I have to wait 72 hours, make 2 appointments separated by those 3 days? Should I go to Virginia where abortion is legal later, but it is further, and maybe I have to wait longer for that appointment? They are navigating all of these barriers, helping people trying to figure out when and how they can get an abortion, how they can pay for it, who will take care of their kids, who will cover the cost of the flight, who will help if the flight is delayed or canceled. And at the same time, they are also really struggling because they saw a huge increase in donations after the Dobbs decision, and then that went away. I spoke to a fund recently in Florida whose 6-week ban just took effect on May 1st, and they said we saw a huge spike after Dobbs. We have not seen another spike, even though there's a new law took effect. And we are struggling now much more than we were after Dobbs because we have a 6-week ban. We are going to be sending most people out of state. We are the 3rd biggest state in the country. Our closest options are North Carolina and Virginia. They know they're going to turn people away, and they don't know what people will do. In all likelihood, people will try and find a way to fall behind on their rent, take up credit card debt, do what they can, or they will stay pregnant.
I was going to say, how has their work changed post-Dobbs and really post-pandemic too, right? Because those two things were happening generally at the same time. We saw, of course, the rise of using abortion pills because it just helped. You could get them through telehealth. Obviously, we're now watching that battle unfold. Even specifically with Cobalt, which is the abortion fund that you spotlight in Colorado, the conversations I've had with them is they are just seeing a massive uptick in people who need help. It's really, really incredible how many more people need abortions in Colorado, how many more are calling them. I think part of it is also there's more visibility on them. People know about abortion funds in a way that they didn't. But also the travel has become more expensive, in part because people are traveling further than they were before, because things in general are more expensive now. That is how inflation works. And also because more pressure on these abortion care systems means people are getting care later in pregnancy. They are being pushed from what might have been in the past been 10 weeks to 12 weeks because of these long wait times. And the longer you wait for an abortion, the more expensive it becomes. And so at the same time, as you see heightened demand, you also see heightened demand for something that is more expensive, and you do not see your resources growing commensurate to meet that. I think it also just brings us to the idea as we talk about Colorado or places like New York and California, what is the safe haven myth? Because I think a lot of us look at those states and we think, oh, blue, anyone who wants abortion access there, you're good to go.
This is a section of the book. It is called The Safe Haven Myth. It is very, very close to my heart because I think there was a real complacency that I heard from a lot of folks in states like California and New York after Dobbs. They said, well, we'll be fine. This isn't really going to affect us. And also, people will just come here and we'll help them get out their abortions. And in no way is any of that really realistic. The doctors I spoke to in California, they absolutely have seen more patients coming from out of state, but they do not feel that the resources being put in place are adequate to meet them. At the same time, they know that they are not going to be able to see everyone who comes to them now. They are seeing longer wait times, even in San Francisco, which is something that comes up in the book. And they also know that this is too far for a lot of people. It is just not realistic to ask someone to fly from East Texas to San Francisco or LA for care. You are often talking about cases where people have never been on a plane before, and you're asking them to fly while they're navigating something incredibly stressful without any certainty as to whether they could someday be prosecuted. The other thing that comes up in the New York chapter, which is one of my favorite things I got to write about, is in my past KHN life, I love to write about Medicaid. Medicaid is so fun. It is so interesting.
Yeah, who doesn't?
And what's really interesting is that New York has positioned itself as this leader on abortion rights and abortion access. And if you look at what Medicaid has covered for abortions, because it is the rare state that reimburses for abortion, it is below the cost of providing care. That is the reason that so many clinics in New York provide abortions only through the first trimester, even though it is legal through viability. And that is because they can get close to the cost for doing medication abortions, but not for the DNCs, et cetera, that are required once you hit week 12 onward. When you can't make that financial model work, care won't be available. And I was in Maine last night talking to some folks there about, what their experience has been with abortion, and abortion is now legal all through pregnancy in Maine, but doctors don't provide it that far, in part because, doctors aren't trained, they don't know how to do it, they haven't done it before, but also because it is very expensive to provide that care, and if you don't have payment structure set up to incentivize it, it won't matter. It's a right in theory, but not in practice.
The other half of the safe haven myth that I think about, although this is an issue that, in practice is apolitical, when I was reading this, I was thinking about, okay, New York elected the bulk of Republicans that helped Republicans take the majority. And one explanation that I thought of and I heard from some really smart strategists was, well, this is not their words, safe haven myth in practice politically, right? Anyone who might be motivated to ballot box might think, oh, well, I don't have to vote on abortion here in New York because it's not on the ballot. We've got a Democratic governor and it's a blue state. If I elect Mike Lawler or Despacito or whatever Republican, it's actually fine.
And this is something that I tried to tease out in a chapter about Florida, because Florida, we all spent a lot of time thinking about Florida in 2022, the state that defies the well, of course. But it was the state that defied the red wave narrative, and it was the one state where abortion didn't seem to influence electoral outcomes. And one thing I heard from lawmakers who lived there and from voters there was, why would we vote on abortion? The 15-week ban that was in effect there didn't really register to them as something incredibly prohibitive. They did not feel like their rights were under attack, even though something we'll get into is what 15-week bans mean in practice. But in theory, at least, when people did not perceive abortion as something at risk, it did not rise to the level of salience to vote on. And another point that you do make about the presence of very strong conservative pockets in states like New York and California is it does add another level of risk for providers themselves. And all the sections in the book that really delve into the violence that abortion providers face focus largely on those blue states. There have been, death threats and violent attacks against healthcare providers in San Francisco, in upstate New York, in places that are governed in theory by Democrats, by people who support abortion. But in reality, the stigma that we talked about is still so pervasive and still so viscerally threatening that it deters people from providing or seeking care.
I think that's such an excellent point. We also are in a time right now, and we got into this a little bit, where people are talking about abortion more, they are sharing their stories more. I even see it just in the way that we're able to pitch more stories that get on television or get written about this topic. That's a marked change for people who've been covering this for a decade. But the work you've done here, I think, is the most inclusive catalog that I have seen in the body of work around this. I want to read a little bit. In chapter 8, you talk about Jasper, and I think the first sentence of that chapter will catch people's attention because it says, Jasper never even considered that he might be pregnant. Tell us that story.
Jasper was someone I really, really wanted to include in the book, and I'm really grateful that he gets to be one of the, I think of as the core work. He is a trans man in Florida who became pregnant when the 15-week ban was in effect. He did not think he was pregnant. He had all these unexplained medical symptoms, and no one thought to test him for pregnancy because they looked at him and they saw a man. And when he finally got tested, he was told he was 12 weeks. He booked his abortion appointment. He was really, really scared. He knew he could not have a child this time. He was in college, still figuring out his life. And he also knew he didn't have much time because Florida clinics were overwhelmed. And when he got his first appointment, he learned he was actually 14 weeks along. He had 1 week to make this decision for himself, to decide, do I stay pregnant or not? And Jasper's story matters to me for a lot of reasons. One is because it does illustrate what those 15-week bans mean in practice, which is still very, very difficult to figure out what is right for you, especially if you don't have regular periods or people don't think to test you for pregnancy. And I think his story is important because of who we talk about when we talk about who get abortions. And it is not only an issue that affects women. There are trans men who get abortions. There are non-binary people who get abortions. The attacks on abortion rights and the attacks on access to gender-affirming care are linked ideologically. They are linked in terms of political pragmatism. The laws that we have seen passed in states trying to limit access to gender-affirming care follow the anti-abortion playbook. They limit care for minors. They limit how abortion covers care. They demonize healthcare providers. They defy medical evidence. I have talked to folks who work in both spaces who say they trade strategies on the protecting rights side because they see how similar these are, and they also see that these are forms of healthcare often provided in the same clinics because they have been so siloed from the general practitioner's office in so many situations. And I think the chance to tell Jasper's story for me was a chance to, A, try and offer what I mentioned earlier, that idea of correcting the narrative of who we center when we talk about who gets abortions, but also to help build out more of that connection and help people consider the context in which we are seeing abortion bans and other restrictions on reproductive health care take effect, and consider how they might be related.
I thought you did such a beautiful job with his story, but there is also, I think, a push and pull within the pro-choice movement right now about how best to talk about this moment in time. There are some people who say we have to just say it's women because it alienates people who might be more moderate people who we just want to get them on board with where we are right now. Then there are other people who say, well, we need to be inclusive about this. The term childbearing people is really important for that reason. Talk about if you encountered that push and pull and what some of the rationale is on both sides for it.
And I'm lucky in that every person I spoke to for the book, I did speak to lawmakers and politicians, but I really spoke to healthcare providers and to patients. And for healthcare providers, the way they describe these people is with that word, it's patients. And I think that is so interesting because there are these really powerful political tensions. And I would argue that they extend beyond whether to talk about trans rights. They talk about, whose stories are we highlighting? And there is a reason that what we discussed earlier, the idea that the public faces of abortion are largely white women, are largely women who are upper middle class and middle class, and women who want to be pregnant. That's a political calculus, and I'm a journalist, I'm not a strategist, I'm not an advocate, but I think that's worth noting. And I do think that for us, as we write the story, we can be cognizant of those political strategies, we can be aware of how people think about who and how and what stories to tell, but our foremost duty is to accuracy. And it is accurate for me as someone writing the story and thinking about the people who are affected and those who are affected unequally, to think about, for instance, someone who is trans, someone who is a person of color, someone who is of lower income, someone whose abortion is not because of medical complications, but because of something much more insidious, like the inability to afford to be a parent.
And truthfully, that is something that crosses any amount of these debates that strategists and advocates are actively having. I mean, whether or not this was, a deep thread that you followed, but I hear this often, and I'm sure you do too.
I think it is something that is really interesting for us to think about, and I think it's something for us to watch as we look at how the debate over abortion unfolds in the coming, several years, if not decades, as we look at what abortion might look like in the future. But it is also something that we are going to watch advocates who support abortion wrestle with, because they are having deep debates, not only about, whose stories to tell and how to talk about this, but there is real, conversation over, do they support reproductive ballot measures that go to viability or earlier than viability, if they would restore some kind of access, or will they withhold their support and resources and campaigning only for things that are even more expansive, that are more protective than Roe was. And that is a political calculus that, based on how people decide what their preference is, will have vast implications for people's lives.
Absolutely. I mean, to the point, if we ever get to legislating at a federal level on this, which I think we are well off from for a while, that is going to be a key question that they have to answer. Your book goes state by state, Texas, Florida, Colorado, New York. Where are you looking, though, for the next battle on reproductive access? If you had said Louisiana and we were doing this conversation 2 days ago, we would have surprised, but you have to pick somewhere else then.
I will always say Texas. And that is true for many reasons. I love Texas. I think it is a beautiful, complex, big state with wonderful people, and it is politically very interesting. Texas is where Roe came from. Texas is where Roe died. It is where SB 8 took effect. It is where a lot of the thought leaders in the anti-abortion movement live and practice and work. It is where we have seen a lot of strategizing over how to move forward on something like medication abortion, over how to address issues like people traveling out of state to navigate abortion bans. And it is also the place with the biggest stakes for the anti-abortion movement because it's their biggest victory. That is the second biggest state in the country. Most people in this book are people from Texas. That's where you find people. That is where most people who are trying to navigate abortion bans do live. I think that if I were to only live in one state for several years and try and figure out the future of abortion, I would pick Texas.
Is that because of what they're doing in terms of some of these bounty hunter laws? I mean, they're getting creative in the ways that they can try to curtail people and make them afraid to access this care?
I think that they have some very smart minds that are working on how to figure out how to further restrict abortion. The man behind Texas's 6-week abortion ban, the foremost original bounty hunter law, he's really, really smart. He is one of the intellectual leaders of the conservative legal movement. I think that we are going to see exactly that more, talk about how to restrict travel on a town-by-town basis, how to find ways to get around medication abortion. There's a reason that the Mifepristone case came from Texas. Also, that is where the judiciary is extremely stacked. And I just think that there is also a really vast potential for us to think about inequality as it exists there, because the poorest parts of the country are in Texas, in places like the Rio Grande Valley. And also some incredibly wealthy parts of Texas are there too, like a city like Austin that has seen rapid growth in income and shifting politics as more people move there. I think if we want to understand America, we can understand Texas.
It's a fascinating microcosm, truly. That's the next battle. I am desperate, as I near the end of my list of questions and begin to look at all of you, I'm desperate for you to tell me where there's a bright spot.
That is a really interesting question. And I'm going to answer that by telling you about one of the characters in this book. Her name is Angela, and Angela really made a big impact on me. She is the young mother who lived in San Antonio who needed her abortion soon after the Dobbs decision. She had a young boy. She had very, very recently given birth, and she still owed money from that pregnancy. She wanted to go back to school. She wanted to become maybe a nurse or an accountant, and she could not have a child. She lied to her family, took all the money that she had. She and her then boyfriend traveled to New Mexico, got her abortion, and it was really, really stressful for her. It was very scary. They didn't know what this would do financially in the long term to have spent all this money so quickly. And then I spoke to Angela some months ago, and things are looking much better for her. Because she was able to get that abortion, she is slowly getting back on her feet. She got a new job. Her boyfriend is finishing up college now. He's her fiance. She is making plans to go back to school. She wants to become a nurse. They've moved into a bigger place. They picked a room for their son. They have painted it with beautiful colors that he likes. It's a big step up from the small one-bedroom that they had where the doors were falling off. And all that was made possible for her because she was able to find a way to access healthcare. And it also reminded me, as someone planning this and talking to people who, when I saw them, my friends, it was a reminder that people are so much more than the worst things that happen to them, and people are remarkably resilient. And when I think about what it means for us to live in this world and to keep moving forward, I think about someone like her, who I think is a real inspiration.
Wow. I needed that. I have a personal question. You touch on something that I talk about a lot with sources and friends. The idea of being a journalist right now who is female, who can see herself and her friends reflected in the stories that they're telling. Do you have those moments of dissonance where, okay, this is the story that's happening, I'm writing this headline, I'm writing this lead about whatever restriction, and also I know that it could directly impact me. Do you keep that at arm's length? I mean, how do you deal with that?
I have some really great resources, like my place of work, which is a wonderful, wonderful newsroom. I love the 19th. You should all support the 19th. Become a member, become a donor.
Definitely do. They are so wonderful.
But more importantly, I have editors who understand that we write about issues that affect our lives and that could change our well-being. And they are very clear about, we've had a hard interview, take a moment, go for a walk, think about something, read. I have wonderful friends, I have a great therapist, and I also do remind myself that the things that make this harder, like seeing yourself and seeing your life and your stories, makes you a better reporter. Because A, you understand things like what a 6-week abortion may actually mean, because you know how a period works. But also, people trust you when they know that you understand them, and that they know that you could be just like them. I have talked to the people in this book about what it means to, take a pregnancy test, about what it means to have period prints, what it means to, feel really sad, or to like a certain video game. And I think that ability for us to connect makes us better storytellers, it makes us better askers of questions, and that is, I think, worth feeling scared and vulnerable. It also has a sense of stakes that sometimes our journalism misses, and I think it really needs.
I hear that in a real way, and I think it's like the true embodiment of bringing your full self to work and being in a place that really allows that.
And I do think it's worth noting that when I think about the best reporters covering abortion, they are mostly young women, and they're mostly actually of all ages. And it's hard to say that there's not a line there. Like, you write about this well and with passion and grace and care when you see yourself in your work.
Yeah. I also appreciate that in this current moment, we are asking more men, more male politicians to speak on this. And in a lot of cases, it's becoming clear that they don't know what a period is, or why a 6-week ban might present more difficulties. And I do love that too.
Yeah, I hope that Greg Abbott had a chance to reread a biology textbook.
We're going to do some audience questions. I know that our friend here has a microphone and can walk around. You were first up with your hand in the front, so... Oh, right there on the side.
Hi, my name is Eli. I have 2 quick questions. One question is, for years, both parties loved talking about the issue of abortion and how it could always go away on the right, celebrating it on the left, or getting scared. As you said, they weren't prepared at all, even with the 2-month preparation. Why do you think that is? And the second question is, in 2024, a lot of people talk about how it's going to be like one of the big issues. You've talked to a lot of people. Do you actually think that's going to be true? And how big of an issue are people overstating it or understating it?
Thank you.
I'll first start with the historical question, which I do think is really interesting and really important and often litigated. And one thing that we do need to consider is that the makeup of the parties has actually changed a lot. And if we look to the last time Democrats had the power to codify abortion rights, it was Obama's first term. And there were a lot of anti-abortion Democrats. And there were some pro-abortion Republicans. And getting birth control provisions into the Affordable Care Act was a very, very heavy lift. And I see people nodding like Julie who covered this. And that changed a lot. We don't have more than a couple of anti-abortion Democrats left. Similar, we have maybe 2 Republicans who support abortion rights. But the idea that this has become something that A, could be treated as a priority, but B, that would actually align in terms of those local majorities is actually quite new. And I mean, I think there's lots of room to talk about blame and prioritization. I do think that it is worth noting that when he campaigned, Barack Obama said, I'm going to sign abortion rights protections my first day in office, and then was like, well, I have bigger fish to fry. But the politics were different, the makeup of parties was different, and the sense of states were different, in part because people did take Roe for granted, and it is very radical that the court overturned something that had been intact for that long. To the question of the election, and I do want this to be something that we both answer because we'll have very smart thoughts as well, but what I have been really struck by is this is a major issue for a lot of voters in a way that it was not before. Public opinion of abortion itself has not changed if you look at the history of polling. But the extent to which voters say it is a top priority has changed. And there's a growing cohort of younger voters and older voters who say that they need to vote for someone who shares their views on abortion. That wasn't true before. That said, this is the first post-Dobbs election that is about candidates and not issues. We have seen abortion win again and again at the ballot when it was a standalone ballot measure, disaggregated from the package of Joe Biden or Donald Trump. And we don't have that now. So I think it is going to be a real test, and anyone who says they know the answer is lying, or has a very, very big, bold sense of themselves. But we do not know if voters will say, I care about this issue more now, but I also care about it enough to outweigh how I think about the economy or immigration or anything else out there.
I think that's spot on. The other thing I would say is, I was out in Ohio last year when they had a ballot measure on it that did not have the word abortion anywhere in it. It was on a random Tuesday that they set up just a few weeks before, and millions of people voted. People don't do that. That's not a thing. Everyone who was watching this race who I talked to was like, are we sure? Millions of people voted on this ballot initiative that ultimately allowed us to try to enshrine. This wasn't even the thing that enshrined abortion rights. This was the thing that let them try to enshrine abortion rights later. And you see these little electoral plot points, and we are in such an untested time. Post-Roe is like a science experiment in so many different ways, but electorally, it's what makes 2024, to me, someone who's just a nerd about politics, fascinating. And every single time I talk to Democrats who wonder, oh, should we lean into this? Republicans who wonder, oh, will they keep leaning into this? All I say to all of them is, never underestimate the power of women who are enraged. And they are.
And one thing that I do think that you touched on as well is that Republicans don't have an answer to this. They are really, really struggling to try and find a talking point that works. And maybe someday they will, but we are not there yet.
Yeah. Next question. Yeah.
Hi, Rachel. Congratulations. I was wondering, it's such an accomplishment to publish a book about anything at any time, and it's even harder to write something about something that's a moving event. It's a historical book on the Civil War or something, and so I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how you approached covering this immensely fast-changing, confusing topic as you're reporting.
This is a really good question and something that Kara and I talked about a lot because we had to be strategic at certain points and we also had a bit of luck. And the strategic part was we knew that things would change. We knew that there would be things in this book that were correct when we sent it to print, a few months ago, and that would have changed a little bit by the time it was published, like Florida's 6-week ban taking effect, or like the recent back and forth in Arizona that I wrote about in the book, but by the time I do not make it to the repeal of the 1864 ban. But what was very important to us was figuring out the themes that we wanted to cover. Something like what a 15-week ban means, something like how pre-Roe bans work in practice, what it means to live in a blue state, what it means to be in a red state, how the politics around this are changing. And we also wanted to focus on people. And what we understood was that the politics, the facts, the laws will change. They will keep changing well after this book comes out. They changed while I wrote this book. There's a lot of PDFs on my computer of how it changed. But the stories of the people did not change. And no matter what happens in the law, the way people's lives have been altered, I think, is like a deeply irrevocable truth that will have really immense staying power. It's also really hard to put the pen down. It really is. I was so when I got to go through it for a third time, which they didn't offer me that, I was so thrilled. I was like, great, more edits, this is awesome. Now we know that Shefali is sick.
There was another hand that I saw way in the back. I don't know if you still have a question. Yes.
Hi, I'm Christine. I'm also an abortion journalist. Shefali, I greatly admire your work. That was a loud microphone. I guess my question is, I've kind of taken a step back from reporting over the past couple of years because I had a baby in the pandemic. And I have been both heartened by some of the reporting that I've seen, but also really frustrated by some of the same sources and tropes being re-upped. Like NPR had a segment on maybe a couple of months ago, and they were talking about fetal pain before 20 weeks, and they weren't citing ACOG, saying that is actually not factual. And I wanted to know, I think that it's important that we all kind of hold each other accountable and try to make the reporting better without attacking each other. Like, how can we do that? And, what are some of the frustrations that you're seeing in the abortion journalism coming out today?
That's a good question, and I want to begin that by saying that there is a lot of work done that I really, really admire. I was talking to a former colleague recently who has been tracking how abortion coverage is done compared to the civil rights movement. And what she found was there were so many reporters out there dedicated to the civil rights movement. And we don't have that now. We do not have the same level of resources being put onto this, even though it is a large-scale human rights and healthcare issue. I think what I think about a lot is that there is a lot of pressure on our industry as a whole right now. There is not as much money coming in. We are constantly changing our business models. And people are being asked to do more with less, which, David Simon always says, you can't do more with less, you can only do less with less. And what that means is, we are being, I know that it would be very hard for me to be thrown into covering something that I did not have a history of covering. And I think if I ever saw something that I was like, ooh, that's not how I would have framed it, I don't think that's quite right. Like, I am good friends with a lot of reporters, and I would message them and say, hey, just for the future, in case this is helpful, this is something I find helpful. But I think this is a really tough thing, and there has been a very effective anti-abortion movement that has been very good at getting its talking points normalized and inculcated, and there's a reason that people still say heartbeat ban even though there is no heart. And there's a reason that people still say womb, even though that is seen as a term that is used to make it seem more personal and less medical. And I think all we can really do is keep trying to support media as best as we can, and keep trying to offer each other support, and more importantly, information that we find helpful and hope others will do the same for us.
I will also say, I've watched the way, and I say this from the network perspective because sometimes they might be slower as larger organizations to adopt different editorial themes. I will say I have found there is a lot more of a push to correct the idea of, this is one we do all the time. Democrats want abortion up until the moment of birth and after. That's not how I correct it on TV. But we are empowered, I think, more now than ever to push back on those with facts that have become almost ingrained in us as reporters, and I think that's a bright spot and a positive point is that more people in a newsroom feel empowered to know more of these facts that are simple fact checks, and I hear you that it's an imperfect system, but I do think that there is a clear dialogue between people who cover this on a regular basis.
And there are people in this room whose faces I see tonight who have been incredibly helpful to me. Elizabeth is there. Thank you, Elizabeth, for everything. And we are very lucky to have people who have just given so much of their time and resources to make this harder.
Hey, Shefali.
Hi, Grace.
Congratulations. Want to ask you, something I really like about this book is how it discusses the evolution of the anti-abortion movement, particularly with Texas onward, so that weird 9-month chunk between Texas and Roe. So I wanted to ask how you specifically see the continued evolution. Specifically, we saw this week with Louisiana and the criminalization or the listing of those abortion medications as controlled substances. So how does that continue, this evolution that we're seeing of the anti-abortion movement? And what can we expect to see going forward in states that have already banned abortion? How are they continuing?
I think SB 8 was a tremendous, in some ways, surprise victory for the anti-abortion movement. This should not have worked, and it did. Elena Kagan was very scathing in oral arguments about that law, and it happened. And then leading to the Dobbs decision was the culmination of a 50-year project. It emboldened the anti-abortion movement in a way that they have never really had capacity to go before. And what that has led to is exactly what you point to, which is they are much more aggressive now than they would have been. There's been a Rubicon that they have not crossed, which is criminalizing pregnant patients. There will be individual prosecutors here and there who go after people, on something like chemical endangerment, which is not supposed to be talked about with pregnancy, but they will try and do that. They will try and go after individuals for self-managed abortion. There are terms of race and income in which they discriminate who they prosecute. But we haven't seen that broad effort yet. And I think that is something I am really curious about watching in the months and years to come is, first of all, their deep concern that these abortion bans that they have are not really working as intended because people are getting wholesale into states and they are traveling out of state. And the anti-abortion movement would love to make that very, very difficult, if not impossible. Whether that means scaring people or passing laws that can find a way to end this, although it's legally very difficult because we have a constitution that protects your right to travel, and also we have shield laws that are actually quite effective. But figuring out how to stop people from getting around abortion bans is tremendous. Figuring out how to go after medication abortion on a state level and on a national level is something that I think will be a huge priority for the anti-abortion movement, especially if we get into a presidency again. And then just figuring out, will they ever criminalize pregnant patients? I think that is something that we don't know the answer to yet. It is something they have seen as a political loser for a long time, but depending on how this election goes and what options they feel like they have on the table, it is something that we have to be aware of as a real possibility.
We've got 5 more minutes, so probably time for 1, maybe 2 more questions. Yeah.
Hello. Having spent time on the ground and seeing the consequences of dogs in person, what do you think this administration could have done to mitigate the harm but hasn't?
That is a great question, and it is something Allie and I have talked about many times. I don't know the answer to that. I think there was a lot of conversation very early on when we had the leak, when we had the Dobbs decision, about legal experimentation, about whether it was worth trying to do things like putting abortion clinics on federal lands, trying to allocate federal funds to support travel, even though they can't support abortion themselves, whether there were ways to more early on safeguard people's medical records because, there was this concern that if you got an abortion in one state and went to your home state, Epic would share it, and that your doctor would see that you got this. These are things that I think there was a real sense of pressure from the abortion rights movement to, as they describe it, try something tranny. And that didn't really happen. I think there's a lot of really valid debate over whether it should have, whether that would have put patients and providers in more danger, to have done something that could be legally challenged. But on the other hand, I have heard people make the argument that the anti-abortion movement for a long time kept trying to do things they knew were not legal and they knew would not pass, and that's how they won. And that argument goes that if you are hoping to try and mitigate that same thing, you need to fight with the same level of creativity and pressure. And I think we're starting to see that with shield laws, but there is a sense of urgency and creativity that could have been more prevalent. There could have been more dialogue. I went through and read the news coverage after Dobbs' oral arguments. It didn't make a lot of waves in a way that you think it would have, given its seismic impact. And even just talking more about this could have done a lot. It could have, at the very least, ameliorated the shock people felt and given us a world where people are more prepared.
Maybe I surmise one of the reasons the coverage might not have been that is because most of the justices sitting on the court said Roe was settled law, testified to that, part of the Senate.
They did, and then funny how things change.
And on that note, I do really appreciate all of you coming out tonight to hear about this wonderful book and to support the amazing author. Everyone give a big hand.
You can make your books are available at the register, so please go purchase them and then come up and have them signed. If you can fold up your chairs and leave them